3 friends, a quiet weekend in the woods. We never should have opened that door. Something ancient was waiting for us, something hungry. Now, no matter how far we run, they're still coming, watching, waiting. I can still hear the humming. It's getting closer. Subscribe now and step into the darkness with us, and let us begin.
My name's Jake Reynolds. I'm 28, originally from a small town in Ohio, but I've been living in the city for the past few years. I've always had a thing for adventure. There's something about the unknown that excites me. I grew up exploring the woods behind my house, and now, living in the city, and I'm always looking for that next thrill. Hiking, camping, exploring old buildings, you name it. Some people might call it reckless, but I just call it living. This weekend was supposed to be just another getaway, but I didn't know what I was walking into. I didn't know what would find me in those woods. It all started when Evan, Dan, and I found that old house up on Ridge Road. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, a little hiking, a few beers, just some time away from the city. We'd rented a cabin, but on the second day we went exploring and stumbled across the house. It sat alone in the woods, half covered in moss and vines, looking like it had been forgotten for decades. We should have left it alone. But curiosity took over, and we decided to check it out. Dan was the first to say it. "Let's go inside." He was always the reckless one, a bit of a show-off, and this was exactly his kind of adventure. The front door was unlocked, creaking as we stepped inside. The house had a stale smell, thick and moldy, like something had been rotting there for years. Dust floated in the air, settling on the faded, peeling wallpaper. There was barely any light, just thin slits of it seeping through the broken windows. The floorboards groaned with every step. As we walked through the rooms, we noticed little things that were off. In the living room, there was a series of strange symbols carved into the wood around the fireplace, crudely done, like someone had hacked them in with a knife. Upstairs, we found a bedroom filled with old dolls, their faces chipped and cracked, staring at us from every corner. And in the back room, we found something that made my blood run cold. A series of photos hung on the wall, each of a different person, each face twisted in fear. The eyes in those photos almost seemed alive, wide with terror, as if they were staring right back at us. Evan tried to laugh it off, but I could tell he was uneasy. "People used to live here. They probably had strange tastes, that's all," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. We decided to head back to the cabin, but as we turned to leave, Dan noticed a faint humming noise coming from below us. It was barely there, like someone was singing from deep under the floor. We all heard it, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Maybe there's a basement," Dan said, eyes wide with excitement. He took out his flashlight and found a narrow door just off the kitchen, hidden behind a large old cabinet. He pulled it open, and there it was, steep, crumbling stairs leading into pitch darkness. Something inside me screamed to stay back, but Dan was already halfway down the stairs before I could protest. "Come on, don't chicken out," he called back. Evan and I exchanged a look, but we followed. The air grew colder as we descended, and that humming sound grew louder. It wasn't just a tune. It had words, but I couldn't make them out. My skin prickled as we reached the bottom, where a single light bulb flickered overhead, barely illuminating the space. The basement was cramped, filled with old furniture draped in white sheets, and a damp, earthy smell that was almost unbearable. But the worst part was the walls. They were covered in scratches, dozens, maybe hundreds of them. Long, jagged lines, like someone had clawed at the bricks over and over again. Then Evan found it, a trap door, hidden beneath a dusty old rug in the corner. He stared at it, his face pale. No way, we shouldn't mess with that. But Dan, of course, was already lifting it. Beneath was a dark pit, so deep I couldn't see the bottom. That humming was louder now, echoing up from below, a steady, haunting tune that seemed to pull at us. Dan grinned like he'd just won some kind of dare. "You guys scared?" "Shut it, Dan," I muttered. But even as I said it, I felt something, a compulsion, an urge I couldn't explain, to look down into that darkness. And that's when we saw them. Pale, bony fingers gripped the edge of the trapdoor one by one, as if something was climbing up from the depths. We all froze, staring, as a figure slowly rose into view. It was a woman, or at least something that had once been a woman. Her skin was gray, stretched tight over sharp bones, and her eyes were hollow pits. She moved slowly, her limbs jerking with every step, like a puppet on strings. We backed away, but she kept coming, her mouth opening in a silent scream, that terrible hum still echoing around us. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw more of them. Dozens of shadowy figures crawling up from that pit, all with that same dead-eyed stare, their faces twisted and empty. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Evan's arm. Dan was ahead of us, bolting up the stairs, but as I turned, I saw him freeze. A child, no more than 6 or 7, was standing at the top of the stairs, blocking his path. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes dark and empty. She raised one finger to her lips, a warning, as Dan stood there, frozen in terror. And then, with one quick movement, she lunged, sinking her teeth into his arm. Dan screamed, trying to pull away, but she held tight, dragging him down, her strength inhuman. We didn't wait to see what happened. Evan and I raced up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind us. I could still hear Dan's screams, muffled but desperate, as he fought to get free. But soon, the sound was drowned out by that humming. Evan was in shock, barely able to speak as we stumbled out of the house. I grabbed him, shaking him. "We have to go!" But as we ran, I looked back and saw them standing in the doorway. The woman, the child, and dozens of others, watching us, their hollow eyes fixed on us with that same hungry, empty stare. We didn't stop running until we were back at the cabin. I locked every door, barricaded every window, but deep down I knew it wouldn't keep them out. They had seen us. They knew our faces. And something told me they weren't going to let us leave that place alive. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, those dead, empty eyes staring at me. And then, just before dawn, I heard it again, that humming. It was right outside the window, growing louder, filling the room with that strange, hollow melody. I held my breath, praying they'd go away, but the sound only grew closer. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. Evan and I looked at each other, our faces pale. There was no way out. We were trapped. The last thing I saw was that same pale child, standing in the doorway, smiling as she raised a finger to her lips. Evan screamed first, a guttural sound of terror that sent a shockwave through my body. The child didn't move, didn't blink, just smiled wider, her lips splitting to reveal teeth too sharp, too jagged to belong to anything human. Behind her, the shadows began to crawl into the cabin, twisting and writhing, pulling themselves closer to us like smoke given form. I grabbed a fireplace poker from the hearth, gripping it so hard my knuckles turned white. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice cracking. But my words felt hollow, useless, swallowed by that endless, haunting hum that now reverberated inside my skull. Evan backed away, his legs hitting the coffee table and sending him sprawling to the floor. The child tilted her head, almost amused, and then she stepped forward. Not walked, glided, her feet barely touching the ground. Behind her, the figures from the house began to fill the room. The woman was among them, her empty eyes fixed on me as her skeletal hands reached forward, claws clicking together like brittle bones. I swung the poker wildly, hitting nothing but air. The figures were too fast, too fluid, their movements unnatural and inhuman. Evan tried to scramble to his feet, but one of the shadowy forms grabbed his ankle, yanking him down with impossible strength.
He screamed again, kicking and clawing, but it was no use. They dragged him across the floor as more hands reached out, pulling him toward the door. "Help me!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with raw panic. I lunged to grab him, but as my hand brushed his, the child stepped in front of me. She raised her hand and I froze, unable to move. It was as if an invisible force had gripped me, rooting me to the spot. Evan's screams turned to gurgles, then silence. When I finally managed to wrench my gaze away, I saw him being pulled into the darkness outside. His eyes were wide, filled with unspeakable terror. And then he was gone. The shadows swallowed him whole.
The humming grew louder, more discordant, filling every corner of the cabin until I thought my head would split open. I dropped the poker, clutching my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me now, gnawing at my mind like teeth on bone. The child stepped closer, her pale face inches from mine. Her empty eyes seemed to bore into my soul, and for a moment, I couldn't tell where I ended, and she began. She reached out, her icy fingers brushing my cheek, and whispered a single word, soft and sweet. "Stay." The child's icy fingers lingered on my cheek for what felt like an eternity, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. That haunting hum filled every inch of my skull, vibrating through my teeth, rattling in my bones. And then, somehow, my body snapped back into action. I shoved her away, her small, fragile form barely resisting, and bolted for the cabin door. My feet slipped on the blood-slick floor, the shadows reaching out like grasping hands. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My lungs burned, my vision blurred, and the night outside swallowed me whole. I ran through the woods, branches clawing at my face and arms, the freezing December wind biting into my skin. Behind me, I could still hear the humming, soft at first, then louder, like it was coming from everywhere at once. Shadows darted between the trees, fleeting shapes in the corner of my eye. I didn't stop running until I saw the faint glow of headlights on a distant road. When I burst into the police station, I was barely able to speak. My clothes were torn, my face streaked with blood, some mine, some not, and my hands were trembling so hard I couldn't hold the paper cup of water one of the officers offered me. "Calm down, son," Officer Hayes said, his voice steady but firm. "Take a deep breath and tell us what happened." I tried. I told them everything: the house, the basement, the trapdoor, the creatures, Evan and Dan, and the child, the humming, the shadows. My words tumbled over each other, disjointed and frantic, but I couldn't stop. I needed them to understand. I needed them to believe me. They didn't, but they still sent a team to investigate. Hayes, a few other officers, and even a forensic photographer headed into the woods with me, leading the way. I didn't want to go back, but Hayes insisted. We arrived at the cabin first. It was quiet. Too quiet. The door hung open, creaking slightly in the wind. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the faint smell of rot clung to everything. The inside of the cabin was exactly as I'd left it. Overturned furniture, blood smeared across the floor, the fireplace poker still lying where I'd dropped it. but there were no shadows, no figures, no humming. "Where's your friend, Jake?" Hayes asked, his voice low.
I pointed to the basement door, and the officers descended the stairs, flashlights cutting through the darkness. I stayed upstairs, trembling, staring at the faint scratch marks on the walls. And then they found the photos. Pinned to the walls of the basement, in neat little rows, were pictures. Hundreds of them. Each one captured in horrifying clarity. The twisted, terrified faces of Dan and Evan. Their eyes wide, their mouths open in silent screams, their skin stretched tight with terror. One of the officers retched in the corner. "What the hell is this?" Hayes muttered. But then they found something else. My camera. I didn't even know I'd brought it, but there it was, lying on an old crate in the corner of the basement, still turned on, its memory card filled with photos. Photos of Dan, photos of Evan, photos of me. In some of them, I was standing behind them, smiling. In others, I was holding the camera up to their faces as they screamed. "No," I stammered, backing away. "No, that's not... I didn't take those." But the evidence said otherwise. They arrested me that night. The prosecutor painted me as a monster, a sadistic killer who'd lured his friends into the woods, tortured them, and documented every horrific moment. They said I'd invented the story of the house, the shadows, and the child to cover my tracks. My pleas fell on deaf ears. They sent me to the county asylum to await trial, a cold, sterile place where the walls are painted white and the fluorescent lights hum overhead. The doctors ask me questions every day, calm, measured questions about guilt, remorse, and delusion. But they don't understand. At night, when the halls are quiet and the orderlies make their rounds, I can still hear it. The humming. It's faint, drifting through the vents, growing louder with every passing night. And sometimes when the lights flicker, I see her, the child, standing just outside my cell door, her finger pressed to her lips, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. She's waiting. They're all waiting. And I know deep down, they're coming for me.